Thousands take to the streets in Brazil in support of President Dilma Rousseff, plus the island nation of Cuba prepares for a historic visit by U.S. President Barack Obama. Thanks so much for joining us for teleSUR English. I'm Coddy Weddle. Happy Friday. To begin today, after political turmoil was sparked by members of the judiciary and the opposition yesterday in Brazil, former President Lula da Silva has been officially confirmed as the minister of the government. A federal judge has confirmed Lula's appointment as chief of cabinet after another judge tried to stop it. Judge Luciana Tertuliano annulled the decision by Judge Preto, who caused controversy after posting pictures of himself at protests against the government. And supporters of President Dilma Rousseff and the Workers' Party have been taken to the streets to counter the protests against the government. The governing Workers' Party says both Lula and Dilma are being targeted by the right-wing opposition to delegitimize their governments. And the Brazilian lower house's commission to impeach President Rousseff has begun sessions. The commission has been criticized given that most of their members are being investigated or have been linked to the Petrobras corruption scandal. Mexican activist Nestora Salgado has been released after spending a month in prison. Salgado was the leader of a community-organized police in Guerrero, created to face the lack of response of official police. Now, at a press conference after her release, she said she has spent more than 2 years in prison for denouncing corrupt politicians and called society to fight along with her for all of the political prisoners. Nestora Salgado's freedom was achieved thanks to grassroots movements and international human rights groups. In Honduras, social movements and the opposition Libre Party have delivered an appeal against President Juan Orlando Hernandez to stop the ruling party's attempt to allow immediate re-election. Former president and leader of the Libre Party, Juan Manuel Zelaya, says re-election should not be allowed, specifically before resolving Juan Orlando Hernandez's involvement in a corruption scandal with Social Security funds. Thursday in Mexico, the free speech watchdog group Article 19 published its annual report on the state of journalism and the defense of free speech and the safety of media makers in Mexico. Now, Mexico considers to be considered one of the most dangerous countries in the world for the profession, and this year's report only solidifies that reality even further. Our correspondent now, Clayton Kahn, files this report from Mexico.
Over the course of 2015, aggressions towards journalists in Mexico increased by more than 21% compared to 2014. 7 media makers were killed and over 397 aggressions were documented throughout the country. For one journalist from the violence-stricken state of Veracruz, the route to the problem continues to be the same.
What we demand is for justice to be carried out, because it is precisely the impunity that allows for certain kinds of aggressions by various actors, by politicians, organized crime, and local landlords to commit these aggressions.
According to the Mexico director of the Journalism and Civil Liberties watchdog group Article 19, Dario Ramirez, the 98% impunity rate in crimes against journalists in the country is based on the reality that the crisis in free speech is systemic.
Public servants are the main perpetrators. Although the official narrative points to organized crime, and yes, organized crime is in second place, how can we have a system of robust protection at a federal and state level when the main perpetrators continue to be public workers?
However, the executive director of the organization, Thomas Hughes, underscores the international perspective of how Mexico treats free speech and media makers. He says the country is in a paradox, pointing to the progressive legal measures that on paper protect the rights and safety of journalists.
There's all the bits, all the working parts that should exist, and we have more than most states. And at the international level, UNESCO and other bodies are copying this, they're replicating this model in numerous countries around the world. But why doesn't it work as well as it should here in Mexico?
The annual report produced by Article 19 posits that a growing climate of fear and intimidation is dominating the profession in Mexico. And while journalists express optimism the growing wave of digital and online media platforms as an important alternative, those spaces too are being targeted.
Small media outlets are the ones doing the investigating. This style of investigative journalism that was brought by the big media companies at the beginning is now being done by the small digital outlets. And that's why there's more violations. In the end, the government doesn't want the investigations at depth. And well, it's a contradiction, because if they want a democracy, we need to have a wide variety of free speech.
The report found that the growing plurality of these digital media platforms, many of which are independent and critical, are increasingly becoming the target of sanctions, criminalization, or attacks by institutions or individuals of power. Clayton Khan, teleSUR, Mexico City.
Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro has traveled to Cuba to sign new agreements on bilateral cooperation. His official visit comes only days before U.S. President Barack Obama makes his historic visit to the island nation. Victims' organizations in the Jewish community of Argentina mark the 24th anniversary of the attack against the Amia Jewish Center. Activists gathered and also remembered the late attorney Alberto Nisman, whose death sparked controversy last year. Investigations on the case and Nisman's murder continue there. Thousands of sardines amounting to over 150 tons washed up on Chile's shores. Now, experts believe that the massive amount of sardines dead was produced by the effects of El Niño, the El Niño phenomenon, caused itself by global warming. The natural phenomenon is having destructive effects in South America. For the first time, the World Congress on Biosphere Reserves took place in Latin America. Our correspondent in Peru now reports.
Peru has hosted the 4th edition of the World Congress on Biosphere Reserves of the planet. Hundreds of government officials, academics, and NGO representatives from around the world came to Peru to discuss ways in which to preserve the biosphere. As part of its commitment to the cause, the local government is placing a heavy emphasis on promoting self-regulation of economic activities that affect these vital areas.
The concept of biosphere reserve needs auto-regulation. That's why it grabs my attention that the one setting up a proposal on Machu Picchu is not Cernam. Do you know who it is? It is the tourist business people, the tour operators, because they realize that with no regulation in Cusco, the golden eggs will disappear.
The conference produced a framework plan for the participating countries, which was titled the Lima Plan. However, for expert Silvia Sanchez, the plan needs binding mechanisms. As she explains, mining and oil activities are closing in on the 4 large reserves, and the state needs to play a more active role in protecting them.
Immediate action would be for the state to step in with a firm hand in some aspects, such as applying sanctions. It needs to have the freedom to apply sanctions and the capacity to develop them.
Many Peruvian social movements that work in issues related to the biosphere, such as the Inter-Ethnic Association for the Development of the Peruvian Forest and Rights, Environment and Human Resources, did not receive an invitation to the conference. Rael Mora, teleSUR, Peru.
Chile's parliament has approved a set of reforms to expand the current abortion law. The reforms include allowing abortion in cases of rape, where the mother's life is in danger, or when the unborn baby will not make it through the delivery. Meanwhile, Venezuela's parliament has rejected the president's request to extend special economic measures to boost production. Venezuela, you'll remember, is facing economic turmoil due to falling global oil prices.
Venezuela was a country that received $3,500 million a month. We are receiving $70 million a month. If that is not enough for the opposition lawmakers to consider that we should declare an economic emergency, I don't know what the country they live in. What's prevailing is that political short-sightedness, political destitution, aspiration has led them to believe that this emergency is the right time for them to take political power.
On March 21st and 22nd, U.S. President Barack Obama will visit Cuba ahead of the historic trip. Our correspondent Bianca Perez reports from the U.S.
The announcement made by President Barack Obama about his upcoming trip to Cuba is, according to the White House, another way to keep taking steps forward in the reestablishment of relations between the two nations. Those who support the island nation see this as a victory for the Cuban people, who have endured a number of laws imposed by the U.S., which are aimed at removing the current government of the island.
But this is a major step, the first president in many decades from the United States to visit Cuba. It represents a victory on the part of the Cuban people to resist and to maintain their self-determination and their sovereignty.
Though the visit is seen by many as historic, there are those who believe that the U.S. agenda against the Cuban government has not changed. The visit to some signifies a political tactic which has as a final goal the downfall of the Cuban government.
But ultimately, they think this is about kind of overwhelming Cuba with, an influx of people and an influx of, commodities and things like that, so that it'll weaken its revolution. But Cuba as well is also resolute that they're not going to compromise the principles of the revolution.
One of the biggest obstacles that continues to stand in the way of a true reestablishment of relations is the economic blockade that was imposed by the United States on Cuba over 50 years ago. Recent negotiations have led to more flexibility in certain regulations that allow an increase in trade and travel, which demonstrates there is no need or justification for continuing the blockade on the island.
I think the embargo will be lifted step by step, and by the time we reach a formal written agreement about the embargo, much of what the embargo has prohibited will be allowed, will be going on.
Taking into account the anti-Cuba campaign that has for years been the norm in the United States, a question arises. Will President Obama's visit to Cuba be only a formality used to check off another list item? Bianca Perez, teleSUR, Washington, D.C.
The suspect of the Paris attack, Salam Abdeslam, has been wounded and arrested in a raid on an apartment in Brussels. Abdeslam had been on the run since the Paris attacks in November. The raid took place in Molenbeek and took place after Abdeslam's fingerprints were found in a Brussels apartment that was raided on Tuesday. At least one other suspect is believed to be holed up in a building in the same area. The European Union and Turkey have sealed a controversial deal to curb the flow of refugees arriving from Africa and the Middle East.
We agreed that all irregular migrants coming from Turkey into Greek islands as from this Sunday, the 20th of March, will be returned to Turkey. The implementation will be phased in gradually and based on the so-called one-for-one principle.
The UN's Syria envoy Staffan de Mistura has met with both the Syrian government and the main opposition earlier today. Mistura restated his praise of the HNC for submitting a detailed proposal outlining its vision for a new Syrian government, and has urged the Syrian government to submit clear proposals by next week for peace talks in Geneva.
I clearly told the government delegation that the procedures are there. If they want, we can talk about it, but we need to avoid addressing the substance in the end. The people in Syria do not need procedures, they need realities.
We have moved at the pace that we wanted to move, which is to engage seriously on substance. And I think during this week that is what we have achieved. We have presented detailed documents that are serious working documents on which we think the UN Special Envoy can now work.
Germany's Red Cross has increased its help for the thousands of migrants stranded at the Greek-Macedonian border. The NGO sent a basic health unit to treat 10,000 people to Idomeni in cooperation with the Finnish Red Cross. At least 12,000 people, including thousands of children, have been stranded in the camp, where sanitary conditions have deteriorated after days of heavy rain. Thousands defied a government ban by staging sit-ins in Baghdad. The protesters were demanding a reshuffle of the prime minister's cabinet and the firing of all corrupt politicians. Former Pakistan President Pervez Musharraf has left the country after the Supreme Court lifted a travel ban against him. Musharraf is facing multiple charges that include treason and murder over the assassination of former Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto. Musharraf's lawyers have said he needs urgent spinal treatment, not available in Pakistan. Right-wing politician Geert Wilders attended a public hearing at a high security court earlier today. He has been charged of inciting hatred and discrimination against the Dutch Moroccan minority. Wilders is the leader of the anti-Islam, anti-migrant Party for Reform. Syrian refugee and swimmer Yusra Maridini hopes to fulfill a childhood dream by qualifying for the Rio Summer Olympics. Maridini competed at the short course World Championships in Turkey in 2012, but fled the conflict in Syria along with her sister Sarah in August 2015. She now resides in Germany. So far, 43 high-performance athletes who are also refugees have been identified as possibly being eligible for the Games. Poland has opened its first museum in tribute to Poles who lost their lives helping Jews during World War II. Now, it's located on the exact spot where Nazis executed a young family for providing shelter to Jews. The president there honored descendants of the Polish rescuers, who he said had made dramatic choices. And that's what we're covering on this Friday. Thanks so much for joining us. Be sure to follow us over the weekend on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We'll see you back here next week.